Welcome back in to the B-Sides of Sports. I'm your host, Wilson Wong, alongside my co-host, Drake Howard, and we're back after a little bit of an off-season break, heading into the NFL season, and the NBA is quickly coming around the corner. Drake and I thought the most appropriate way to hop back into the podcast was to have a general conversation about how we define greatness. And while it might seem a little bit random, it's a conversation that comes up a lot across all of sports. And, when we think about the GOAT debate in these main sports, there's a lot of different criteria that people want to prioritize and kind of weigh in that conversation, ranging from winning, longevity, team success, individual moments, storytelling, just your character inside and outside of the sport. And so Drake and I thought it would be fun to kind of have an extended conversation on this greatness debate. How do you define it? What do you weigh? And so, Drake, I'll kick that question to you as we begin this one. What do you weigh when considering the GOAT debate?
Yeah, so I think one that I consider that I feel like I don't see talked about a lot, it wasn't even on your sheet when you were kind of explaining to me what you wanted this pod to be about, and that is the infrastructure around the player. So I think what's so interesting is so often, like, if Tom Brady played in Cleveland and did what he did, I think it would have been considered the greatest feat ever. And he did go to the New England Patriots, who were bad. But that's not the point. They just gotten a new young head coach who'd come off 2 Super Bowls with the Giants. So it's a little different than Cleveland, who's had just an entire history pretty much since the days of Otto Graham and Jim Brown of greatness. So they're just so far removed from it. So for me, the infrastructure of a guy around him is something I consider a lot for greatness, because it's why one of the reasons I'm so adamant on LeBron being the greatest player of all time, because he could not have had a harder position to try and become what he became, but he still did it amongst all odds in an ever-changing NBA that kind of went away from what the league never really featured forwards as a premier player. It really went from big men to guards. But despite that, he kind of found this middle ground to succeed. And I'm not discounting what Jordan did, obviously, because he pretty much made guards what, we think of them today, where they're really who you run your offense through, right? Him, and I guess you could say Magic more so, but Magic also was so much of a playmaker where Jordan wasn't nearly as much. But to me, that's kind of what I look at. And getting back to what I was saying about LeBron and why he's so insane to me is he had so little stability around him, coming from a single parent, going straight from high school to the pros and delivering right away in a poverty franchise that is the Cleveland Cavaliers. That means so much. I mean, geez, the dude's had 30 head coaches, it seems like. It seems like every year they're talking about his head coach getting fired. And despite all of that, he's maintained his greatness. He showed it wasn't the system, it was him. Similar to how a guy like Peyton Manning did it, or another. I like to use, Jordan as an example, because he had so much stability. He had Pippen and Rodman for almost all of his glory years, and they had a good cast around him cycling out. But at the top of that was Knight, and obviously, I mean, we all know what he's done for the godfather of the NBA, right? So I just think what I look at and admire so much more about LeBron is how he's been able to do it wherever he was. And with Jordan, we didn't really see that, because look at him on the Wizards. What did he do? LeBron at that same age was carrying Lakers squads to the finals. Jordan wasn't. So it's the same reason I like Peyton Manning so much. He had 6 head coaches to Tom Brady's 2. It's all this instability that really shows guys who can get through adversity. Because to me, if you can play through everything, truly everything, that to me is what greatness is. Someone who's great no matter the circumstance, no matter the situation. Joe Burrow. Jamar Chase is out for half the season. He put up better numbers with Jamar Chase out than with Jamar Chase playing, which is crazy. But you realize then how much a guy like him can just change the game plan on the fly. His game plan when he goes there isn't, I'm going to force feed Jamar Chase. It's, I'm going to make the best read, but that just happens to be Jamar Chase 90% of the time because he's great. That's a guy who's great. Went to Cincinnati, another historically terrible team, and has already flipped their culture. And people are saying he's a playoff choker. That's absurd to me. This is a dude who's flipped a team's culture in 3 years. That is, I think, one of the most important factors for me in greatness, is doing it no matter the pieces around you and just proving that you have that X factor, that it mentality, the stuff you can't put on a stat sheet. Ironically, for how much time I spend looking at stat sheets, I discredit them a lot when I'm talking about the greatest of all time, because I really think the best stuff isn't titles. It's not longevity. It's what you did when you were playing, no matter what was happening around you.
I think that's a really good way of framing it. I really like the angle you took there. And, you didn't blow the lead at all, going straight to the heart of the two most core debates I think people have when considering the GOATs across a lot of these sports: Brady versus the field in football, and then Jordan LeBron in basketball. And, to me, when I agree with you, the context of this conversation is so important. It's the part that is overlooked a lot of the time. I think a lot of people want to make the argument a lot more black and white than it actually is. Personally, I think winning is the most important thing above all. How much did you win? But behind that, I would put an asterisk of what was the context under which you won. I think you're right. The weight of Brady's 6 rings in New England is a lot different than, maybe Manning's 1 or 2 with two different teams. And, when I think about winning across all sports and the context of how you win, I think it's not just the infrastructure around you, but also how you elevate or how you build in that infrastructure that is around you, right? To me, Steph definitely isn't even in the conversation of basketball for the greatest player of all time. But I think what Steph has done better than probably better than anyone except 2 or 3 people in the sport of basketball is he elevated the circumstances around him. Golden State obviously wasn't a great franchise before him. They'd won, but they hadn't won a lot. And, when you look at the core that was built around Steph, a lot of people want to give credit to the front office and, what they were able to draft, how they were able to build. But I also think Steph was an integral part to that being built around him. And to me, that's an important thing that goes overlooked. And again, it kind of falls within the context of how did you win and why did you win? And again, I think that fits really well within the frame of how you're thinking about greatness. When I think about the individual side of greatness and how much we should weigh it, to me, I think there is kind of a baseline threshold that a player needs to reach in order to even be considered for, the GOAT of their sport. But once that threshold is passed, I think, again, it jumps more to the story of how you won, what you did for the franchise or the team that you're competing with. And again, it's the story that tells. And to me, that's where the storytelling becomes an incredibly important part of this. I'll flip back to my first point about how the conversation sometimes can be black and white. I think with basketball, people often want to make it, were you the greatest to play or are you the best basketball player ever? Did you win the most or did you have better stats and could you dominate a game more than any other player? And to me, that's a little too black and white. We can go to Bill Russell. Some people want to say Bill Russell has a spot in that conversation simply because he has those 11 rings. To me, that's a little too black and white because the context of Bill Russell winning those rings is that there were 8 teams in the league at that time. Again, it's still an impressive feat, but in a league where player movement was at an all-time low, when the NBA started, the player movement was basically non-existent. Of course, the best team was going to win every year because nobody left that team and no other team got any better. And so to me, to just black and white say, if you think it's the most winning, it's got to be Bill Russell. If you think it's the best player to play the game, it's got to be LeBron because of the stats. I think that's too black and white. And while I would lean with you, I think LeBron is the greatest of all time. It's because, the points you pointed out, it's the context under which he won. And so to wrap kind of what I was saying there, I think once you reach the baseline of individual statistical success, and to me, you've got to be a 99 percentile guy. There's not that many. But once you're in that room, the greatness story becomes more about what you did and how you did it, as opposed to just your stats or just your winning.
No, I agree. And I think that, what's just so hard with me for championships is maybe being an NFL guy. There are so many greats who never won because it's so much harder. It's so much more of a team effort. If you're a great NBA player, chances are you're going to win a ring, especially in today's era where there's so much roster movement, like you said, compared to back before there was a player union and things like that. Or salary cap. So that just didn't exist. But in an era where Dan Marino never won a Super Bowl, but he was throwing for 4,000 yards in an era where Earl Campbell still was headlining the league, a running back. That, to me, I think Dan Marino is the second best ball thrower in NFL history, only under Aaron Rodgers. And that's just, again, a testament to how great he is, but he didn't win a Super Bowl. He went to one in his rookie year and then, didn't win and didn't make it back. So then it's hard for me then to say that he isn't one of the greatest of all time. So I think that's kind of where our frame of reference shifts because as an NFL guy, Super Bowls mean a lot less to me than, again, what you did when you were playing. So many of these guys, like Odell's a big one for me. Odell's peak is one of the things that, it is one of the greatest peaks of a wide receiver of all time, even though his team didn't do anything. Only had one playoff appearance, and they lost in the first round to Green Bay. Even though that happened, his dominance from a rookie with an old Eli Manning and an aging Giants roster that had so much turnover at head coach, he put up numbers after numbers after numbers, and then he got injured and it kind of curtailed his career. But to me, he still is one of the greatest receivers I've ever seen. And I say that because the dominance level to be able to take a slant to a touchdown every single play, that matters to me more than the fact that now, again, he never won a Super Bowl in his prime. That doesn't really bother me. Guys like, I'm trying to think of another example, but there's just so many guys I feel like who, in the NFL especially, like I said, it's so much more of a team effort. So in the NBA, I do think there's more credence to championships. I think you're right. I think there's almost a minimum threshold in NBA, right? Like, even though I love Russell Westbrook and I think he's one of the greatest point guards ever, his lack of a championship and longevity makes it hard, because in the NBA, those two things are weighted really hard, unless you're Michael Jordan, because then we just give you the longevity out of the window. But regardless of that, that's why I think that's one of the reasons these debates get so jumbled, is also partially because of the sport crossover. Every sport is so different, but the GOAT debate exists in all of them. And so sometimes it's hard to almost shift your frame of reference and be like, okay, I'm talking about the NBA now, where careers are longer and championships are a lot easier to come by because there's so few people on the league, right? So I think that makes it kind of hard too, because you really do have to shift your frame of reference every time you switch a sport, because they are so different. And I truly believe the GOAT debate in each sport takes shape a little differently. I think there are very few uncontested greatest players of all time. Like, I can think of maybe 3 or 4 at their position, tops. So I just think that's, to me, where I agree with you in some capacity, but also I disagree from a standpoint of, I don't think Dan Marino should get discounted because he never won a Super Bowl. I don't think Drew Brees should get discounted because he never missed a Super Bowl. The most accurate quarterback in NFL history. He has 1 Super Bowl, though. So a lot of people struggle to put him in the top 5. But Joe Montana, look what happened after Joe Montana. They got Steve Young, and they won more Super Bowls. So was it Joe Montana, or was it what was around him? Or then you can make the argument, did he elevate the roster when it was around him and then put it in a place to succeed with a different quarterback? So I get that these are all the arguments, but just from my frame of reference, to me, it's the winning at all costs and showing, not winning at all, but the being competitive at the highest level, no matter the circumstance. That's what's most important to me.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of really great points there, and I want to pivot the conversation in just a moment to kind of the conversation of individual sports versus team sports and how greatness is different. I think you're right. Greatness can be defined in a lot of different ways across different sports, and, just for our conversation's sakes, I think basketball and football are two of the most complex sports to define greatness, in part because they're so different, right? In basketball, one player has, to some degree, a lot more impact over the game. They play both sides of the ball, and they can play up to the entire duration of the game, where in football, the game's very positionally dependent, right? And how do we kind of weigh the impact of the quarterback up against, a defensive end, right? Two incredibly different positions that don't even, necessarily match up straight against one another. How can you kind of weigh greatness in that context? So yeah. I want to take the conversation there in just one moment, but I do have a follow-up question to the points that you're making right now. And again, this goes back to that core question of how do you define greatness? I think it's a fluid thing, right? People define greatness differently, and that's why people have different factors that they weigh more importantly stacked up against one another. To me, I think winning at the top doesn't necessarily summarize your winning, right? Like, you can be a very winning player without necessarily having chips, right? Like, rings at the end of the day, you could ring count all you want. Some players do a lot of winning, they might not win at all. And so to me, I think a question that always pops up to me is, how do you weigh how well you played the position and how well did you play the game in the context of the winning that you can do, not necessarily winning titles again, versus how you would, how important is it to show that you can win it all? And I think your answer, just hearing what you're saying so far, you lean towards there's a greater importance of how well you play your position, right? Like, your peak is, how you stack up against your competition is very important, as opposed to just, for Odell, just being a receiver, he doesn't necessarily directly impact his team's ability to win a title year in and year out, right? Like, obviously he does, but it's like Odell can't just go out there and be like, I'm going to set my mind to it and I'm going to make sure we win a title this year, right? Like, yeah. It's QB dependent. It's how good is the defense? How good is the coach? So, I say all that to say, how much do you weigh just how well you played the position against your contemporaries, and where do you stack up against in history?
So that's very important to me. I mean, James Harden being one of my favorite players, I think says all about it. This is a guy who's changed his role to 3 very separate things, going from a 6-man true scorer to then a true scorer as a starter on Houston, star of a franchise, to then a playmaker as he got stars on the team, to now predominantly a playmaker, offensive being his second capacity. To me, the ability to adapt and overcome and change with the league around you and to change the league It's one of the reasons I think James Harden is a top 5 shooting guard of all time. Because what he did, I think you can make an argument that no one had really ever done in that capacity. And again, he hasn't won it all. And a lot of people complain, oh, well, this and that and the other, right? He gets a lot of knocks because he doesn't want to chip, because that's another thing that always hinders the GOAT debate, in my opinion, is championships really have just become winning is a stat associated to certain players. In the NFL, it's notoriously attached to quarterbacks and unfairly attached to them. In the NBA, I think it's unfairly attached to stars, because so often if you're a guy like Giannis Antetokounmpo, they expect you to be winning every year because, you know, we see you on the court and you're so good. James Harden got that treatment his entire career, but he never won one, and it looks like he never will, unfortunately. So that to me means a lot, because I value guys who do the best at their position, even if necessarily they aren't getting the ultimate success, because I think sometimes it's hard to have that mindset. Like a guy like James Harden never missed the playoffs in his career. His usage rate is absurd. It's like over 35% every single season, pretty much. That being said, then he gets to the playoffs and he doesn't play as good because he's exhausted, and then he gets knocked for it. So that's why, to me, I do think it's important to look at the regular season and how well you are, again, just overall as a player. Because if you're the reason your team got there and then you lose because you didn't have help and you couldn't do it all on your own because you were tired, we were talking about Drew Holiday in the regular season, how being a two-way player affects his legs, and you can kind of tell when he shoots, he just looks a little gas in the playoffs. Like, to me, Drew Holiday still is an elite playoff guard. It's just so often during the regular season that he's scrapping through games that he probably shouldn't play him as many minutes as he does. And that's kind of the thing with the NBA right now. I feel like we see a lot of these star players' minutes just skyrocket because, you know, they are just trying to get in the playoffs, and it's such a battle with how many juggernauts we've had the past few years. So I think that's kind of why I think your positional value is so important to me, because then when it comes to the playoffs, like if you're running into a team like the Warriors every year, that is one of the best dynasties in basketball's history. You know, how much of it is these guys' fault, you know, your Portlands, your Oklahoma City Thunders, that they got matched up against one of the greatest devised offenses in NBA history, versus these teams like, you know, when they play Portland, it's like, is Damian Lillard going to beat Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, and Draymond Green with Yusuf Nurkic? No. That doesn't even seem fair to me. And then people are like, oh, well, Dame's not a good point guard because he never won it all. And I'm like, that's just such an absurd argument to write him off because of one stat, when there's literally a million other things you could point to as him being genuinely one of the greatest scorers from the three-point line in NBA history.
I think that's a great way for me to pivot into kind of not the conclusion, but how I came to my conclusion in this conversation and where my stance lies right now. And I'll pivot to individual sports here for a second. And so, you know, when we think about individual sports and defining the GOATs, I think it's a lot easier. For one, the way the sport's played, I'll use the examples of tennis, swimming, gymnastics, even boxing, right? All of your performance is solely dependent on your performance out there on the field, on the court, in the pool, wherever it may be, right, in the ring. And so when I think about the greatest of all time across those sports, you know, in women's tennis, a lot of people want to say Serena Williams. In swimming, people want to say Michael Phelps. In boxing, Muhammad Ali often gets the nod. In men's tennis, it's a little more, you know, muddled. I think, you know, Djokovic has
There's like three you
name in the hat. Nadal, Federer, right? All of them have a name in the hat. But when I think about that, it is so easy to quantify their winning simply by their rings, their medals, their titles, etc. Right? When we think about women's tennis, right? You know, how many titles does Serena Williams has? When we think about men's swimming, you know, Olympics is the greatest stage for swimming, right? Michael Phelps had more gold medals than anybody else. And to me, that makes it very easy, right? You can definitively say this guy swam in a sport where there are 5 different ways you can swim, and he came away with more gold medals than anybody else. Easy to say that he's the GOAT, right? You can also look at someone's peak, right? In tennis, you know, if people give Federer the nod, right? Federer had a stretch where there was not a single title where he wasn't winning, right? It was like 4 titles in a year. He's winning every single one of them all the time. And so when you look at a guy's peak, it's like the amount of winning he did in the amount of time, you know, it's just very easy to say in an individual sport, you know, he should be the greatest of all time. And so when we kind of translate that over to the sports that we're kind of talking about at our core, basketball and football, I think that's why the conversation becomes so black and white for some people. Jordan's greatest asset to his legacy is the fact that he won 6 titles in 8 years. The 2 years he didn't win, he was technically considered retired, even though quietly people don't want to acknowledge that he played one of those years and he played in the playoffs and lost. And also the fact that in his finals is 6-0, right? And so when people want to chalk this conversation up to how much did you win and in what time frame did you did it, a lot of people just want to say Jordan went 6-0 and he did it in 8 years, right? That's just an incredible peak. There should be no, you know, further conversation. But I go back to, I think the conversation in these sports, when there's other positions involved, when there's other players and there's an infrastructure around you that truly matters to your ability to win, it's too narrow, it's too siloed in that conversation, right? And so I think the final stance that I wanted to take is, I think in basketball, greatness can be defined. And I think you might side with me a little bit here. I think your greatness is defined by the context under which you won, how you were able to win, and how much of you did it with, the peak and the story of your peak. I think the story is very integral. It's why so many people are never going to acknowledge that, like, LeBron even has a spot in the conversation, because the story of how Jordan won is so great. But I think when we look at a sport like football, I don't think it's necessarily a fair thing to label a GOAT in a sport where each position holds so much value, and the sport has evolved so much over the years, right? The running back might have been more important 15 years ago than it is today. You might argue that there's a comeback for the running back position. And you're right. I think we assign so much of the arbitrary value of winning to the quarterback position. It's not fair. What the quarterback's able to do is so dependent on the O-line, the receivers, the coach, even the defense, right? We've seen incredible quarterbacks over the year with just horrific defenses. They can't stay on the field. And so to me, basketball, I think we can definitively say there's a GOAT. Football, I think it has to be by position. And that might be a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but I don't think it's fair to necessarily say, the greatest of all time can't be a running back just because the value of a running back isn't as great as a quarterback. And so to me, I think football has to be by committee.
Yeah, I won't get into this too much, but I think that's one of the things where, to me, in NFL, what defines the greatest players of all time is their dominance, or if they change the position. Because if people changed the game of football, guys like Lawrence Taylor, left tackles are now one of the highest paid positions in the league because he was so dangerous off the edge. Peyton Manning changed the way you called an offense at the line of scrimmage. To me, those two guys, I consider some of the greats because they changed what they did. Or, that's how I kind of look at the GOAT, because I kind of agree with you where I don't think there is a GOAT. I do have greatest at every position, and even the NFL, when they did their 100-year team, they went through every position, even specialists, punters, kick returners, punt returns. They made sure to have everyone because they knew the exact same thing. How do we quantify it? Like a guy like Harold Carmichael ended his career with 8,000 yards. He was a wide receiver, which was the most in NFL history at the time. Now, most guys get that by their 6th year in the league.
Mike Evans is going to...
Yeah, Mike Evans already
is
has
the greatest
that.
Of you.
Yeah. So, they took all that into context, which I really like and I appreciate. The NBA 75 anniversary team did something very similar. So I do agree. I think that's a great kind of closing sentiment, your recap on how there really is no sport GOAT. I think, I don't think I could say it any better. I think for football, it is a lot harder. Individual sports, we can go on all day because it's you versus me, right? It's who I think versus who you think. But in the NFL, there's 40 guys I could think of. In the NBA, though, you're right. There's probably 3 or 4. So I think there's more of an argument, but I think you're right. It is just almost too hard in team sports to have a definitive one, and I think that's why everyone likes it so much. There's no right answer. I could fight with you all day about LeBron being better than Jordan, but at the end of the day, neither of us are right, because who is to say who's greater? No one can. That's the whole thing. It's just a debate. It's purely hyperbolic. We're just guessing. So I think you said it very well with, there really is no, the GOAT debate is just that, a debate. There is no answer.
Absolutely. And that's why we wanted to have the conversation, right? It's fun. That's why you and I, over the next year or two, will probably continue to have those debates on, whether it's basketball, football, whether we bring in a different sport. It's fun to have. And you're right. The fact that there's an open-ended answer, that no one's ever going to be able to sit down and be like, the correct answer to the greatest of all time in the NBA is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? Like, there will never be a definitive answer. And that's why we'll continue to have those conversations. But I thought it was, a fun way to kind of get back into the conversation of sports and just kind of think about the different criteria that people weigh and whether, what's fair and what's not. And I think a lot of the points you made, I really agree with. I hadn't really thought about, I thought about contextualizing winning. I hadn't thought about, like the individual player and how much they impact the circumstances around them necessarily. Mm-hmm. So I really like that. And that's probably a major takeaway I'll take with me as I continue to frame, one day I'm going to crown Patrick Mahomes as the greatest of all time in the NFL. And, I'm sure we'll have an hour-long conversation about that one.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's bound to happen. And I think that's one of the things, too, that, this is part of the GOAT debate. This is kind of one of my last thoughts on it I had down was like so often too, we just want there to be a GOAT because then, media narratives, right? Dethroning so-and-so. I mean, every year I see the debate on First Take. Will Mahomes be able to dethrone Brady? What will it take? Already just assuming that everyone considers him the GOAT and that Mahomes is just bound to overtake him. And it's so silly to me because in a world where you really can't have a definitive answer, the media just likes to have one because it pisses people off and makes a narrative that they can run with.
Most definitely. The last thing I would say is if Patrick Mahomes goes 20-0, does that mean that, does the GOAT debate end there, Drake?
No, it does not. There's no way. No, never. It would take, I don't even know what it would take Patrick Mahomes. It would take Patrick Mahomes going to, I don't know, the Browns and winning 2 Super Bowls. For me,
he's got to change teams. He can't do it on the Chiefs.
Yes, you can't do it with Andy Reid sitting behind Alex Smith for a year with the best tight end in NFL history. That's not the greatest of all time activities, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. But anyways, with that, I think we're going to call it a close. We hope you enjoyed this kind of one-off episode we tried doing. I know we had a lot of fun. It was definitely one of the more unconventional things we've done, but we both really enjoyed it. Soon here, we will officially kick off season 3 once the NFL season begins. Give our picks like we did last year, similar things to that. As we get ready for the NBA season, expect some content about that as well. And we will see you guys in the next one. Later.